Anyway, so the next question we've got here is, what about the history of the Progressive Labor Party? All right. Okay, well, the Progressive Labor Party, it was started in Buffalo, New York. And so the communist, 1956, Khrushchev gives his secret speech. Khrushchev gave the secret speech and threw Stalin under the bus, said that Stalin was bad, Stalin was no good. And that caused a complete crisis in the global communist movement. And in the Communist Party USA, like 2/3 of the members quit, and it was a big disaster. Well, 1957, the Communist Party had a convention. And at the convention, the Communist Party split. There were 3 factions of the party. The first faction was led by John Gates, and John Gates wanted to completely drop Marxism-Leninism and cut ties with the Soviet Union. And he wanted to make the Communist Party a mass party of socialism and merge with the Socialist Party. And then there was the Gus Hall faction, led by Gus Hall and Eugene Dennis. And their feeling was they were going to keep Marxism-Leninism, keep tied to the Soviet Union, but they wanted to denounce Stalin and go along with Stalin, or the denunciations of Stalin, right? And on top of that, I wrote it down. And on top of that, they wanted to denounce black nationalism. The Communist Party had taken the position that black people were a nation. They were a colonized nation within U.S. borders. And the Communist Party supported Malcolm X, and they supported black nationalism, as opposed to the civil rights movement, which just said black people suffer from racism in America, and their goal should be to be equal Americans, right? Part of the American society, just equal. The Communist Party had said black people are a nation and supported black nationalism. So, and then there was the third faction, which wanted to continue supporting black nationalism and defended Stalin, and that was led by William Z. Foster. And so the debate happened, and the John Gates faction and the Eugene Dennis Gus Hall faction teamed up to outvote the William Z. Foster faction. And so the Communist Party officially embraced the Khrushchev secret speech. The Communist Party officially briefly cut its ties with the Soviet Union. That was very short-lived. And it also dropped support for black nationalism. A number of the people in the William Z. Foster faction quit. William Z. Foster was basically forced into retirement. He was chairman emeritus, meaning he was just retired. And then like a year later, John Gates was publishing anti-Soviet propaganda in the Daily Worker newspaper. They kicked him out, and his people were kicked out. So it was people in that William Z. Foster faction of the Communist Party. They were people in the Communist Party faction that was led by William Z. Foster, that they didn't support the denunciation of black nationalism. They defended Stalin. They started trying to form some kind of new party. And there was a group called Hammer and Steel that was formed. And they had a newsletter called Hammer and Steel. And what did their name Hammer and Steel? What did it mean? Well, steel, that's for Stalin, right? Stalin means man of steel. And hammer, what is hammer? It's Molotov, right? Molotov was the leader of the Soviet Communist Party who was pro-Stalin, and his name means hammer. So they were Hammer, Molotov, and Steel, right? Molotov and Stalin, Hammer and Steel. And they had this newspaper. They were called Hammer and Steel. And they were based in Boston. They had something called like the New England Labor Party or something. They were a communist organization that broke away. And Khrushchev actually gave a speech condemning China. And he said, China has fomented a split in the American Communist Party. And they formed Hammer and Steel, right? And Khrushchev mentioned them in a speech. That was like their glowing moment. It was never more than like 10 people, Hammer and Steel. And then there was something called the Provisional Organizing Committee, the POC. And the Provisional Organizing Committee, it was actually a lot of black folks and Puerto Ricans in New York City that quit the Communist Party because they supported the Black Belt. They supported independence for the Black Belt. And they supported Stalin. And so they formed the Provisional Organizing Committee. And they had a magazine called Spark. I think they had another magazine called Turning Points. And they were just people that had been booted out of the Communist Party who liked Stalin. And they had magazines and discussions. Nelson Peary was with them. Harry Haywood was with them. But and it was majority African American, I believe. And they were one group. But there was a guy in Buffalo, New York. He was a college professor. His name was Milton something. Milton, I forget. Milton, I forget what his name was. Milton something or other. And he was a college professor who'd been in the Communist Party. And so he and his friends and allies, they formed a new group called the Progressive Labor Movement, PLM. Originally it was called Progressive Labor Movement, not the Progressive Labor Party. And they were, they were Communist Party USA 2.0 that still liked Stalin and liked China. And they were formed in like 1961, I believe, as the Progressive Labor Movement. And they were very in your face about communism. They waved red flags a lot, and they talked about the workers and the bosses. And really, they were an attempt to bring back the Communist Party of the 1930s, right? The Communist Party in the 1950s was talking about anti-fascism and people's democracy and the danger of World War and the threat of U.S. imperialism. But in the 1930s, in the William Z. Foster days, they talked about the workers and the bosses, right? It was about the struggle for industrial unions. And, so Progressive Labor Party, they tried to bring back the language of the 1930s Communist Party, right? That was their feeling. In the 1930s Communist Party had been more revolutionary. So they worked very hard to bring back the language of the 1930s Communist Party during the 1960s, right? And, I mean, there's something to be said for that. I mean, and they were they grew very rapidly. They were the more radical and more visible version of the Communist Party. They were, the Communist Party was very secretive. They worked in Democratic Party clubs. Well, the Progressive Labor Party was very visible, and they had the Challenge newspaper, and they ran candidates for office, often in the Democratic primary, but they ran on like an open communist platform. And they were in major cities, New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. They were a group, and they were very big during the 1960s. And they were a major communist group. They started to fall apart as the Black liberation struggle got going. When the Black Panthers emerged, there was a bookstore in Harlem, and it was a lot of Black people that joined them. And in fact, in the early 60s, there was a leader of the Progressive Labor Party. His name was Bill Epton, and he was an African-American man who was a communist. And after the police in Harlem murdered an innocent Black man, he put up posters all over Harlem with the face of the cop who killed the innocent Black man with the words "wanted for murder," right? And it was just like a wanted poster for this cop who'd killed this innocent Black man. And so he put up those posters all over Harlem. And then there was like rioting in Harlem. So they arrested Bill Epton. And on the CPI website, we actually have Bill Epton's speech to the court, because he gave this very poetic speech about communism to the court in New York City. And I'm going to post it in here because it's really important. People should read it. Bill Epton was a leader of the Progressive Labor Party in 1962, 63. And he gave Bill Epton's speech to the court. We have it on the CPI website, 1966. I'm going to post it in the chat here. It's very important. It's a very, very important speech that he gave. Condemning racism, condemning capitalism. Bill Epton's speech to the court. He was found guilty. They threw him in prison for putting up posters, right? They claimed he incited a riot, and he just put up these posters condemning capitalism. And there was a whole campaign to free Bill Epton and such. And, the Progressive Labor Party was one of the big communist parties in the early 60s, but up into the late 60s, they started to become a majority Black organization. And the thing was, the people leading it were white, okay? And they were old Communist Party people from the 1930s. And they were threatened by the Black majority that was emerging in the party. And there was, my understanding of it is there was a bookstore in Harlem, a Black revolutionary bookstore, the New World Bookstore, that was run by Progressive Labor Party. And that because the Black liberation movement was the main form of activism that was happening at that time, and because of the fact that that communism was the main revolutionary current in the world, it was mainly Black people that were joining the Progressive Labor Party. And Bill Epton was a very charismatic leader in Harlem. And so as the Progressive Labor Party is becoming a majority African-American organization and such, the Black Panthers emerged. And the Black Panthers were Black nationalists, right? And the Progressive Labor Party saw the Black Panthers as competitors. They wanted black people to join the Progressive Labor Party. They didn't want black people to join the Black Panthers. So the leaders of the Progressive Labor Party, they published a document called Revolutionaries Must Fight Nationalism. And they declared that all nationalism is reactionary. And they broke with Lenin. Lenin had said, we support the nationalism of the oppressed against the national chauvinism of the imperialists. Progressive Labor Party said all nationalism is reactionary. Right? And they denounced the Black Panthers. And they said that the Black Panthers are espousing black nationalism. That is reactionary. And they took that position. And they went all in against black nationalism. And as a result, that started to isolate them from the revolutionary movement because the Black Panthers did not appreciate that. Members of Progressive Labor Party and members of the Black Panthers started to have fistfights with each other. And you can actually read, like Fred Hampton. There's a speech by Fred Hampton that he gave where he refers to those PL motherfuckers. And the Black Panthers hated Progressive Labor Party because they were anti-black nationalism. And after the Progressive Labor Party started taking the position that black nationalism was reactionary, their politics started shifting. Because they were supporting China and, the Soviet Union was supporting the Vietnamese people, they started calling the leaders of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, they started calling them revisionists and saying they were holding back the revolution. When the Vietnamese started negotiating with the United States, they said that was selling out the revolutions. They denounced the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. And, they were encouraging young people to get jobs in factories. They were like ahead of the new communist movement. The new communist movement was later, but they were encouraging young people to get jobs in factories. And, as the 60s political upsurge started happening, 1968, 1969, Students for a Democratic Society and those kind of groups were going into the street and doing street fighting and doing militant kind of street fighting stuff. Progressive Labor was saying, no, go get jobs in factories, which, there's something to be said for that. That's out of the movement to the masses. They kind of got it, right? But they were, at that moment, the action was very much, with the radicals, and they were not supporting the Black Panthers. And their newspaper was just dedicated to every issue, had attacks on the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are black fascists. They're black nationalists. All nationalism is the enemy of the working class. And so by about the early 70s, the Black Panthers, were rising and progressive labor was declining.